to lose you, I'd surely lose myself. Everything I have found here, I'm not found by myself. Try and sometimes you'll succeed to make this man of me.
Look, I don't know what's going on with you and Joel. Guy really cares about you.
I've no need for any more, 'cause I believe, and I believe 'cause I can see our future days, days of you and me.
"2013 was an interesting year.
Yellow 80! Yellow 80! Say that!
This man managed to get his song onto Billboard charts by turning it into a viral trend. Shrek got a Broadway adaptation, and the much beloved 7th generation of consoles came to a close. But what a spectacular closing year it was. Nintendo released its first ever HD console with one good game, while Microsoft was pushing this oversized paperweight onto anyone who was stupid enough to buy it. In contrast, by the end of this generation, Sony's flagship console had managed to completely rehabilitate its reputation, going from being that overpriced George Foreman grill that played Blu-rays to a budget console with some of the industry's best intellectual properties under its name. One of, if not the most significant contributor to this perception flip was Naughty Dog, who with their critically and commercially acclaimed franchise Uncharted, revolutionized both publishers' and consumers' view of what the PlayStation 3 was truly capable of. Having earned their stripes and 4 straight years of praise, in 2013 Naughty Dog set its sights once again on shaking up the industry with an IP that promised to focus more on narrative, stealth gameplay, and pushing the graphical limits of the PlayStation 3. The Last of Us, meeting astounding critical and commercial success once again. Naughty Dog was especially lauded this time around for having raised the bar for storytelling in video games, a feat that came to define the developer's brand for years to come. Remaining dormant through most of the 8th generation, it would not be until 7 years and an unexpected 4th Uncharted entry later that The Last of Us IP was revived to once again push a console on its last legs to its absolute maximum. So, was it worth the wait? Let's find out. While The Last of Us was widely regarded as being the model example for what narrative boundaries could be pushed through the medium of video games, its sequel story has become the most significant point of contention for most players. The online discussion around this game has revolved almost entirely around its narrative direction since before the game was even released, so it's probably best if we address that first. But before I begin, I'll warn you now that this review will be spoiling major aspects of the story. Unfortunately, the game can't be talked about without spoiling, as the event that kicks off the plot in and itself is a spoiler for those who played the first game. So if this is an issue for you, I recommend you stop watching the video now, or skip to the final overview. Alright. The story begins where we left off in 2013, with Joel, our former protagonist, recounting the end of the last game to his brother, Tommy. He explains how he's responsible for there not being a cure to the fungus that caused the mushroom zombie apocalypse. Boom, all of a sudden it's 4 years later and the now 19-year-old Ellie lives comfortably in Jackson, going out on patrols and smoking some good kush when she's got the chance. We then change our perspective again to the story's antagonist, Abby, a member of the Washington Liberation Front, also known as Wolf. She and a small group of friends trip from Seattle to Jackson in order to find Joel to get payback for what he did all those years ago. Realizing they're outnumbered and might have a difficult time finding one person in a place as big as Jackson, the group sets up camp just outside the town and meticulously plans out their daring mission. Oh, wait, never mind. She just bumps into him while walking in no specific direction and manages to lure him and Tommy back to their hideout. Really good stuff. Really good game so far.
Because they have.
Ellie and friends notice the two didn't show up for their posts, so they decide to split up and look for them.
Well, if we're gonna find any ghosts, we better split up.
Ellie, who just so happens to be the one to find the hideout, gets caught and watches Abby beat Joel to death. No! From this point on, the game revolves around Ellie's quest for vengeance against her surrogate father's killer.
You don't know how large that group is, how armed.
I don't care.
Ellie and her girlfriend, Dina, venture to Seattle to find Abby, and the game becomes essentially a cat and mouse adventure where our protagonists go from location to location in search for our antagonist, who always seems to be a few steps ahead of them. Typically, the cat and mouse story structure in video games flows as follows. Character A arrives at a location in hopes of finding their primary objective, Character B. Character B, however, is nowhere to be found, so Character A deduces what happened through context clues, and this is generally visualized to us by viewing the perspective of Character B back when they were at this location. A great example of this is Halo 3 ODST, in which the rookie, in order to find his team, visits important destinations the team has been to previously, such as their drop pods or battlefields, deducing what happened at these locations and where the other characters have gone off to. In essence, there is plot progression at every important juncture, culminating in an eventual confrontation. Not for The Last of Us 2. Rather, the game has us play as Ellie the entire time, and as we go from place to place, our objective is merely to kill all of Abby's friends while we try to find her. When we do finally get that final confrontation between Abby and Ellie, the plot comes to a sudden halt. Instead of playing out that final confrontation, what we've been building up to and finally reached after hours of searching, the game brings us back to the perspective of Abby shortly after killing Joel, and then makes us play through her side of the story, essentially having us make the same journey we just made with Ellie all over again. All of the tension that had been built up to, that had been experienced during the second act, is simply left there to hang as we play through nearly 7.5 hours of additional gameplay that could have easily been experienced earlier in our journey. What the fuck? I paid $80 for this shit. All of the anticipation felt when we reach the conclusion of Ellie's story slowly begins to dissipate as we replay the same puzzle solving, stealth sections, and character interactions that should have been reserved for the game's second act. It's obvious that Naughty Dog had a reason for presenting the story in this manner. They wished to highlight the cycle of violence that these revenge-style stories create, and granted that in 7.5 hours of consecutive Abby gameplay, we as the players do come to better understand the two main factions that occupy Seattle, those being the Washington Liberation Front, or WOLF, an isolationist military community that resides in what was the Seattle Seahawks Stadium, and the Seraphites, an anti-technology cult who inhabit an island just off the coast of Seattle. This section does benefit the game's world building, expanding the lore of this post-apocalyptic world, humanizing those we killed during Ellie's story, and even helping players empathize with Abby, a difficult feat considering this is the killer of our much-beloved former protagonist. However, this massive delay in the game's conclusion manages to screw with the pacing and hamper the emotional weight of Ellie's story, which, in my opinion, stops the game from being truly great. There are other minor aspects of the story that I could also complain about, such as Ellie's trip to California, why the game has us learn more about Abby's home than Ellie's, and why the game just doesn't know when to end. But I think I've spoiled enough for this review. Though the game still offers many of the shocking and gruesome narrative moments that one would come to expect from a Last of Us game, reaching nearly the same heights as its predecessor, the issue of pacing ultimately ruins its overall value. With all that out of the way, let's move on to something a little more positive. The presentation. Graphically, this game looks incredible, easily on par with Sony's other exclusive titles such as Spider-Man and God of War. The character animations are some of the smoothest I've ever seen in a game, and the environments are stunning both in terms of visuals and overall atmosphere, factors which greatly benefits gameplay immersion. Speaking of which, if I could describe the gameplay in one phrase, it would be more of the same. Now, let me explain. The typical level in this game is laid out like this. At the beginning of each level, an endpoint objective is clearly established, and as you progress through the level, you're constantly bombarded with reminders of how close you are to the finish line. Within the levels, you collect materials for crafting and with which you can make provisions, such as medkits, bombs, ammo, gun upgrades, and character performance upgrades. You are constantly moving from one stealth section to the next, taking out enemies one at a time, with the occasional boss battle or other scripted action sequence to keep you on your toes. I've seen this all before. 7 years ago. There have been some minor improvements to the upgrade system that improve quality of life for the player, but none of these improvements are enough to differentiate the game from its predecessor. That's not to say that it isn't fun, because I had a great time playing it, but it just doesn't feel like I'm experiencing anything new. And for a game that's had this long of a development cycle, this can't be overlooked. The Call of Duty games, for example, never really feel all that different from each other because there's a new game in the development cycle each and every year. When you have an entire console's generation's worth of time to make changes, you'd expect a lot more out of it. I wouldn't exactly say I'm disappointed, but it's definitely not great. The Last of Us 2 has been a very polarizing game, and for good reason. Its gameplay does everything its predecessor did right, but offers little in the way of its own merits that would leave a lasting impact. And although its story is ambitious and thoughtful, its very apparent pacing issues cause it to fall flat. Overall, I'd give the game a 7 out of 10. Good, but not great. So if you like what you just saw, be sure to leave a comment below and leave a like, maybe hit that subscribe button. If you didn't, be sure to let me know in the comments and leave a dislike. Have a good one.